Hola, bona tarda, sent bé? Sí? Benvinguts. M'han demanat, in addition, que presenti també el cicle de seminaris i de debats públics sota el nom o el títol Viure Junts, que sabeu que tindrà lloc, ja ha començat aquest matí i tindrà lloc avui dilluns, dimarts i dimecres, als matins els seminaris i les tardes els debats públics. Benvinguts. Agrair la invitació a moderar aquest debat en el marc de la 15a Bienal Espanyola d'Arquitectura i Urbanisme, titulat Building Communities. Volia agrair, en aquest sentit, a l'Anna, a l'Eugeni i a l'Òscar aquesta oportunitat de presentar, de moderar aquest debat. Crec que la discussió sobre la construcció de comunitats ara mateix és molt pertinent i necessària en els moments en els que vivim, perquè és una discussió sobre la gestió de la vida, que en definitiva és la gestió d'aquesta part tova de l'arquitectura a la qual els arquitectes hi estem prestant molta més atenció darrerament i crec que això era bastant necessari. És un plaer retrobar a la Cristina, Goberna, i conèixer personalment a la Paloma Strelitz. Benvingudes. Com sabreu, ambdues són arquitectes rellevants, amb una trajectòria coneguda, reconeguda i influent, pel seu posicionament disciplinar i per l'aportació d'unes obres en les quals la qualitat preval per sobre de la quantitat. Alguns apunts sobre la trajectòria professional d'aquestes dues arquitectes. La Paloma és arquitecta, actualment directora creativa de PATX, un col·lectiu sorgit amb l'objectiu de revisar el concepte de lloc de treball des de la perspectiva de l'accessibilitat i la sostenibilitat, i va ser fundadora del col·lectiu Assemble, col·lectiu orientat a les pràctiques de l'arquitectura participativa i sostenible, col·lectiu que ha desenvolupat diversos projectes d'emprenedoria social i artístics que promou una visió inclusiva de l'arquitectura entesa com un mitjà per influir a les condicions socials i culturals de la vida quotidiana de les persones. El 2020 va ser becada pel projecte LUEP de la Harvard University Graduate School of Design i des del 2017 col·labora com a assessora en disseny a l'equip de l'Alcaldia de Londres. I com bé sabeu, Assemble va rebre el Premi Turner l'any 2015 pel treball en el projecte Grau Before Streets a Liverpool. Cristina Goberna, codirectora i fundadora de Fake Industries, actualment és directora d'Architectural Agonism, un estudi d'arquitectura que promou pràctiques col·laboratives i horitzontals en base a Nova York, Barcelona i Sydney. Un estudi molt interessat en el concepte de còpia en arquitectura i que aposta per còpies arquitectòniques amb modificacions crítiques. Fundadora també d'Epic Architecture, que es dedica a desenvolupar exercicis pedagògics i de recerca. I també membre fundadora d'Institut, grup de recerca dedicat a l'estudi de processos urbans i polítics a partir de vincles interdisciplinars. És professora de grau de disseny a l'Escola Pau i també ha impartit classes a la Universitat de Colúmbia, com també a la UTS de Sydney i a l'Escola d'Arquitectura i Planificació de l'MIT. Ha rebut premis en concursos internacionals rellevants, ha participat a la Bienal d'Arquitectura de Chicago i a la Triennal d'Oslo. Va formar part del pavelló espanyol Unfinish, que va rebre el Lleó d'Or a la Bienal d'Arquitectura de Venècia l'any 2016. M'agradaria destacar confluències importants entre les seves trajectòries. La rellevància i la riquesa del procés de desenvolupament intel·lectual, tècnic i social dels seus projectes és un fet que explica que elles adoptin posicions poc convencionals dins de la professió i aquest fet també explica l'abast social dels seus projectes. Breument, fer esment sobre el significat del CCB i d'aquest pati de les dones. Des del punt de vista arquitectònic sabem que és un edifici emblemàtic i de referència, i des del punt de vista de la ciutat, un lloc d'encontre on arquitectes i societat interactuen. Com sabeu ben bé, la seva creació va respondre a un debat entre l'arquitectura i la societat, entre el fundador, el primer director, Josep Ramoneda, del centre, i els arquitectes Albert Piablana i Elio Piñón, i aquest és un fet que té molt a veure amb la construcció de comunitats. I turn to English. The first questions relates to this interaction between architecture and society. This is why I would to debate about the position of architects in contemporary context. And at this point, it's interesting to pay attention to a certain rapprochement between architecture and society, especially in the European context. A rapprochement that can be read through, for instance, the last two topics proposed in the last Venice Biennale or in the BEO itself. All of them has to do with how to live together and the way to humanize architecture. I would also point out the last verdicts of the Mies van der Rohe Awards. As you already know, both are restorations in existing social housing blocks. And also the awarding of the Prize Pritzker to La Caton-Basal and the posthumous award to the Golden Lion of the Venice Biennale to the architect Lina Bobardi. Tackling like the first question, breaking the ice. Do you consider that your work can be read as a part of this rapprochement between architecture and society?
It's a really interesting question. I've never known an architecture which doesn't see those two as intrinsically linked. I think that's both been a kind of product of my education and also, the culture of architecture that I grew up around. I think a number of those projects which were very formative to me, I know have a connection to, I think, the CCCB and the European Prize for Public Space. So one of the first projects I did was, when I was doing an internship as a teenager, was around the pedestrianisation of Exhibition Road in London. And that's about how you turn what was previously a kind of traffic artery on a very busy street with major public institutions, and how you pedestrianise that and make it a space for public activity. And then again, whilst I was studying architecture, I did my undergrad at Cambridge University. One of the practices which we were very familiar with was MUF, Art and Architecture, who again won the Public Space Prize for their town square in Barking. And so many of those projects which were fundamentally formative to me were all about asking questions about how people inhabit the city and setting up the conditions for people to live more connected, more convivial, maybe more visible lives, but certainly kind of buildings as an infrastructure to support life and facilitate it and enable opportunities in the best way possible. And so then with Assemble, our very first project was to transform a disused petrol station on Clerkenwell Road in central London into a temporary cinema. And that was all about how do you animate a sort of piece of city that normally goes unnoticed. So how do you kind of create a moment of spectacle or theatre out of the otherwise very mundane and everyday, and then really using those sort of opportunities that you get with temporary architecture to create something surreal and unexpected and beautiful, and bringing cinema back into the centre of the city. And I think that that therefore my attitude has kind of was formed both from those experiences in education and then from very early Assemble projects, and it was always about saying how can we create spaces to better facilitate connectivity and sort of everyday life.
Cristina?
Can you hear me? Yes, no? Well, I think that this relation between society and architecture is something that we keep on studying over and over again. No, I can think about May '68, for example, in Paris, where architecture schools started to call sociologists and people that would do policies and artists and all these kinds of people to talk about architecture behind or apart from the discipline itself. No? But I also think that regardless of the fact that maybe our practices are very related with this approximation to society, now we live in a very interesting moment, no? A moment that it's like an inflection point, a moment that requires like really radical imagination, and that we have to somehow work together to see what we're going to do. For many reasons, obviously. One of the reasons is because of the climatic catastrophe, that we can't keep on growing, of course, no? Thinking about architecture. And the other is because the cities are somehow dying and kicking us out. And I think that this is very obvious, and in this city it's very obvious, in London it's very obvious, in New York it's very obvious as well, no? So I think that we have somehow a responsibility as architects with society to bring these issues and this information to the rest of the citizens, which is something that we don't do. I mean, if we think about newspapers, we see that there is a section about literature, there is a section about cinema, there is a section about economics. There is not a section about urban issues or architecture. Even the figure of the critique is dying. I mean, there's a couple, maybe in London there's one, no? There's in New York, there's another, but it's very, very slim, no? So, and at the same time, people spend all their money, all their savings in an apartment, for example, without knowing what is spatial quality, material quality, etc. So I think that somehow it's our responsibility to bring this information and knowledge to society through education, I think.
Mm-hmm. But like maybe talking about two concrete projects, for example, in the Granby project, in a certain moment, this contact with society is direct because you work together, no, with a group of residents, for instance, or in your case, in the competition for the Guggenheim, you had like also like meetings with the citizens, with the city council. How it was like this direct connection with the society? Because even in your case, sometimes you are also designing and building with people, no? And you share like this experience.
So, for people who are not familiar, the project which we did with Assemble in Granby was working with residents who'd formed a community land trust, and it was in a neighbourhood that had been was in central Liverpool. It was the centre of historically the centre of the black community in Liverpool, and there'd been a very famous uprising which had happened there in the 80s against police brutality, and over a period of time that area had been basically systematically dismantled by the government through a kind of process of managed decline. That wasn't just to do with its history, it was also because Liverpool was an ex-industrial city that was shrinking, and they were trying to work out how to manage this enormous amount of physical infrastructure they had with a kind of shrinking community. However, there was a very engaged, politically active community in the Granby Four Streets who always resisted the efforts to move them on and tried to kind of really make the case to the council to stop demolishing our streets, let us develop them instead for community benefit. So we were introduced to them already when they were decades into this experience, and that they had just never been listened to. And I think that we had a very fortunate and productive relationship with them, and they had also been at this moment of forming this community land trust. And so what we were able to do with them, and they were our clients, so in some ways it was quite a formal relationship, was that we were able to create, in collaboration, a vision for that neighborhood which made the case to stop demolishing, and again, I think kind of touching on important issues of sustainability there, and say, if the government, if you don't want these buildings, hand them over into community ownership, and we can create a resilient vision for this neighborhood that can combine affordable housing with commercial spaces and cultural venues, which means that the community that has always lived here can be in charge of their own spatial future. And so you ask about kind of the quality of that relationship, and it was I think it's a good thing that that was actually a quite formal relationship. We were the architects and designers, they were our clients, but what we had was an incredibly close and productive dialogue which was built on trust, which meant that we were able to develop a series of projects over a long period of time. And the last point I'll say is I think that you get enormous benefit as a designer or an architect where you work with one community over a period of time, because that doesn't mean that you have to do everything right the first time. You don't have to have one single uncompromising gesture. You can create a pattern book or a sort of series or family of interventions, and each one can learn from the one before and fulfill a new need or a new aspiration to help build that sort of resilience in that neighborhood and with that community.
And in terms of the Guggenheim competition, for those of you who are not familiar with this specific competition, I think that it was in 2015. Helsinki wanted to have a Guggenheim museum at the harbor, and I think that this is quite relevant here in Barcelona with Hermitage, at the harbor as well. And something absolutely incredible happened, which is that there was this citizen reaction against the museum, right? So there were certain sectors of the population that had certain interests as well in terms of building the museum, but there are others that were huge, that were against building the museum. Even, I think, if I remember well, even political parties were formed, websites, publications, part of the art world was against it. It was really fascinating. And, it was the biggest competition in history. We were very surprised, pleasantly surprised to be one of the 5 finalists. So one of the things the Guggenheim Foundation did that was very rare, I would say, fantastic, is that they took us all to Helsinki and they invited all the parties involved, very especially the ones that were against the building itself. Because, of course, this was a very difficult question. Helsinki, as any European city, maybe doesn't need, a brand like the Guggenheim in a harbor. Why? Because what it attracts is massive tourism that comes in ships, visit the museum, blockbusters exhibitions, leave nothing, and then leave. And also, the city have to pay an incredible, huge amount of money just to have this building on its soil, let's say, right? So it was really interesting. What we did at the end, talking with all the people involved during these official meetings, but also outside of the official meetings, we record them, talk to them, interview them, was understand we designed something invisible so that the main problem that was these blockbuster exhibitions would completely disappear. In a way, we wanted to sabotage the nature of the Guggenheim. How? Well, if you change 2 degrees in terms of the temperature of a museum, then the insurance companies will never allow you to bring a Kandinsky paint, for example. So just by doing that, by giving the right, the possibility to the citizens to change that temperature in a space, which is architecture. Architectures are not only the walls, of course, it's also the technologies behind the walls. This problem would never happen. The boats probably would not come. Local issues will appear more, right? So we had like this collaboration sort of in the underground with the citizens, yes.
Continuing with questions related to the new possible position of architects nowadays. In your case, we figured out that your practice addresses new fields connected, for example, to the definition of the workplace, in the case of Patch, or to the research of dwelling archetypes in, for example, the OE house. It sounds that it's really a research in the way we live together. Is it a research that looks for the definition of uses and new programs, and are these researches generating new formats and new designs?
I think I understand the question. So I've just started a new project as creative director of a new company called Patch, and what we're looking at is the future of the workspace. And in a way, the research field has been the experience of the last year and a half with COVID, and the radical transformation of COVID to our professional lives in this instance. And one thing which we're really interested in is this switch in condition from what has certainly been the case in London, where traditionally we've had millions of people commuting into the centre each day and spending an awful lot of time and money in that journey, and then spending their time and money in central London and leaving the communities where they live, which have in many ways been left behind. So we have these towns across the UK which really have professional communities but struggling high streets and infrastructure. And equally at the same time, we've had the condition of the last year with everyone working from home, and there have been some positives out of that. I think something which lots of people valued is more time with friends and families and in their communities. And I think with Patch, what we're trying to do is turn that into a positive and try to find a middle ground which says people commuting into the centre of London each day, entire populations, is not a solution. Each of us being isolated at home is not a solution. So what is a positive middle ground? And the thing which we're really excited about is building really dynamic workspaces in the centre of these local towns, which create a pull for people to get out of their homes, but a sort of strong enough incentive not to go into the centre of London. And that creates a really vital space in these town centres for people to spend more time with their friends and families and in their communities. And also critically, there are other positive externalities like investment in local high streets, businesses and towns. So really hopefully strengthening and making those spaces much, much more resilient going forwards. And so I suppose it's an interesting question about research, which says, this is not, there's sort of obviously a lot of, academic reading about the future of work, but it's really taking the lived experience as a departure point to say, how can we build back in a more resilient way, which is more reflective of society's, needs and dreams and aspirations.
Again, I think that because of these three newish conditions that we were commenting before, the climatic catastrophe, the very big financial crisis, and this big crisis in terms of the destruction of the city, whatever we did before, it's really, we have to reinvent new rules. The rules that we had now, we can't use them any longer. There's like a new world, we have it in front of our very eyes, So one thing that we have to do for sure is to stop considering architecture as something that operates in permanent growth. I think that we have to stop growing. We have to rehabilitate, we have to do almost nothing. We have to change completely the way of thinking when we think about the city and when we think about architecture. But very especially, I would say, when we think about the city. And I would like to just point out three issues that Salvatore Settis writes in this fantastic book that is called If Venice Dies, and I'm going to say it in Spanish. And he says, la ciudad destruida. ¿Cuándo se destruyen las ciudades? Y dice, punto número 1, las ciudades se destruyen si las destruye un enemigo despiadado. Y yo creo que el enemigo despiadado es el capital que hace que todo el espacio público de repente sea espacio de consumo. Punto número 2, las ciudades se destruyen cuando un pueblo extranjero echa a sus habitantes y a sus dioses o sus tradiciones. Y yo creo que la ciudad nos echa, el turismo masivo nos echa de nuestras ciudades y acaba con nuestras tradiciones. Y punto número 3, la ciudad se destruye cuando los habitantes pierden la memoria y se vuelven enemigos de sí mismos. Y yo creo que la destrucción de nuestro patrimonio, a veces el pequeñísimo patrimonio, sucede todos los días. Solo tenéis que ir downtown Manhattan, Poblenou, si queréis, para ver qué está sucediendo todos los días. Es algo imparable, ¿no? So I think that we have to stop and think about the destruction of the city and how can we stop this process.
Yeah, I think that all these answers has a lot to do with the next issue. Like tackling directly, like the building communities is key in housing. There is an issue that during the pandemic that the pandemic has lighted, the updated definition of the well-being. The interior-exterior relationship in architecture requires a deep debate. The pandemic has underlined the need to enjoy the sun, outside air, proper good ventilation, flexible spaces, how to live and work at home, natural materials, and therefore a thermodynamics that promotes the state of well-being. All these conditions linked to the well-being are contradicted by regulations. For instance, Minergie in Switzerland or Código Técnico in Spain, that requires an increasingly archaic architecture and a mechanical and technological relationship with the outdoors world. In consequence, buildings are becoming a sort of blind and autistic bodies. Based on this, which is the current meaning of the well-being in architecture, and what does really mean sustainable architecture nowadays? I think that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that I sort of want to build on something, Cristina, that you said, which is talking about not necessarily talking about building more, but how do we, reprogram the city that already exists. And I'd like this talk this evening is such an interesting example of that, right? I mean, this is an event that traditionally would be happening indoors in an enclosed auditorium. And yet to create this new auditorium of 100 people, we haven't had to build anything. It's simply been about, bringing together a set of components and articulating them outdoors so that, what has always been primarily used as a courtyard is suddenly, for the first time, being used as an auditorium. And so I think when we talk about well-being and sustainability, I think what's so central to that is looking at what we already have, which is plenty in most, in developed cities like Barcelona or London, and saying, what can we do to use this in a more intelligent way that might actually also be more reflective of how we might want to live in the city. Actually, how lovely it is to be able to sit outside in a sort of early autumn evening for a talk rather than being in an enclosed auditorium. And so the idea that it's a compromise to look within ourselves and say, how can we use what's already there? I think what's critical to me is that that is not a compromise, but that it's a really, really exciting opportunity. And I think that that exists on the one hand, and then actually really what it should be doing is saying, there are plenty of places where we do need to keep building, where they don't have the infrastructure in place, and I'm sort of thinking of places, say, where there are large, cities with large informal settlements, and recognizing that actually they might need more formal architecture to to develop their more resilient futures. But I think going forwards, what we're really looking for is how to create a better balance, and I see that as making better use of what we have actually created, and then also, giving places and communities who perhaps have not had that, the freedom to and license to develop for themselves.
I think that the term well-being, as a New Yorker, it's really funny in a way. I don't know if you know Fran Lebowitz. Otherwise, go to Netflix and take a look at Pretend to Know the City. And she has this guide of anti-wellness. She said, like, this hippie thing the anti-wellness, no? I mean, she says something like, your bad habits could kill you, but the good habits will not save you, no? And I think that well-being is it's a problematic somehow term, because at least from the culture that I come from, that is over there, it could become something extremely selfish as well, no? I mean, for my well-being, I'm going to buy this avocado, and I'm going to put it in a toast. For my well-being, I'm going to build this thing, and I'm going to put like this fantastic green rooftop, although actually green rooftops for climate could be very bad. It depends on how you build them, right? So I tend to be a little bit suspicious about this term. But I think that it's true that it's very much related with issues that have to do with sustainability. And in terms of sustainability, I will point out at two different sustainability issues. No? One, it's related with social sustainability. And I think that we need to take a look at what do we want to maintain in the cities that are not necessarily, again, their architectures, meaning the way of life, how we shop locally or not, how our children play, how we love and hate in the streets, how our traditions take place, all these kinds of things that actually disappear very quickly, and we see it almost every day. And of course, then we have to think about sustainability that had to do with the environment. And again, I think that the only way to face that is by stopping to grow. And of course, I mean, we can open the discussion because in certain moments we need to build certain things, no? But architecture and constructions are some of the industries that are worse for the environment. I mean, we are not specifically talking about the environment, but one really interesting thing that a couple of years ago Greta Thunberg said was that we need to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And I think that not only the climate is obviously on fire, but the city is on fire again. It's obviously on fire, and we have to act very fast.
Okay, shifting slightly the conversation to other issues. Both Cristina and Paloma have been involved in projects built through ephemeral architecture connected to cultural purposes. Which is the real capacity of these constructions to reactive the city and therefore to be relevant for the community's constructions? In a way, these constructions should be understood as a models, one-to-one, as a testing programs.
Yeah, I think that temporary architecture creates a lot of opportunities. I think the person who writes the most beautifully about the temporary in the city, about ephemeral architecture, is Walter Benjamin, and his descriptions of sort of Naples and a culture of kind of festival and religious and carnival and, you know, architecture which happens there. And so I think the important thing is that I have been involved in a lot of temporary architecture projects, but actually all cities contain ephemeral architecture, whether it comes under that name or not. Like we all live in spaces which host. I mean, this I think again kind of bringing us back into the room. You know, what we're sitting in front of or in is a piece of ephemeral architecture. This sort of set up for one evening and it's going to disappear again. I think what temporary architecture did for me, particularly in my early projects, was it just gave us an incredible license to test and experiment in a way that you rarely get if things are fixed or concrete. And actually, the thing that lets you really do is to take risks and to not fear failure in the way that you know, if you're saying we're building this space or this structure and it needs to serve the needs of this institutional organization for the next 10 years or the next 20 years or the next 30 years, and we've only got one shot at this, then you kind of, you know, there's true skill in that, evidently. I mean, I think that is kind of often the primary role of the architect, but it also comes with its own constraints. And the ability to just test and experiment and say, this might only last for 3 weeks, but we're going to push an idea to its maximum, and actually also perhaps out of that experiment, that piece of theatre really, we'll learn something which we can take forward in our kind of next version of the permanent. And I think that was something which kind of I gained a lot of value from through kind of temporary, more theatrical architecture. And what I found was that I might do one project, so say this cinema in a disused petrol station, and that might only have lasted a month. But one, the photographs, the recording, the documenting of that project has lasted forever. And two, seeing how people interacted in that space, convened in that space, enjoyed that space, taught me really important lessons for how I might want to build more permanent infrastructure. And so I can sort of see a direct line between that temporary project and then what was my biggest permanent architecture project, which was the construction of a new Centre for Contemporary Art for Goldsmiths University in London. And that there were direct lessons which I learned from the temporary, which then have informed what is a permanent, growing cultural institution in London.
In terms of ephemeral architecture, I think that there are different groups or chapters or categories. No? On the one hand, you have those that are directed for the discipline itself, the ones that, for example, you can find in the Venice Biennial, right? And I think that is very important, of course, that there are certain centers that are very intensive in terms of architectural research, like universities with their own speed and language, and they don't need to permeate to the general public necessarily, no? They need to advance. And others that are for the general public, and sometimes they come through biennials. The Spanish Biennial, for example, we can see here installation, the Chicago Biennial as well, no? But also, there is another classification. One, that it's those ephemeral architectures, let's say, that had to do with education and that had to do with information. And I think that here you have a fantastic example, which is urban nature. You should all go before it's too late. Really, it's absolutely phenomenal. And others that had to do with entertainment. And that's it, no? And so there's one that really ignites somehow critical thought, and others that are more nicer, you know, to find, I mean, just something that had to do with entertainment. But I also think that ephemeral architecture or communication, ephemeral communication had to do with other formats as well. In my case, for example, I founded Epic Architecture Theatre Company, which is a theater company that actually doesn't do professional theater. Obviously, we are not dramaturgos, all the respect for the real people that do theater. But we do shows where we explain very sophisticated issues that had to do with real projects for the general population and also for a specialized population too. And I think that this works fantastically well too. Yeah.
Coming back to these new positions of architects, I'm interested in to talk about a sort of contradiction, which for one hand, some architects offers open projects, like open buildings, as for instance, like Atom Basal and their unfinished architecture in terms of programs. And for the other hand, others define a previous domesticity, a previous life that exists in advance before architecture is inhabited. What is the limit of architects' responsibilities in terms of design? And is the historical memory of architectural design a tool to build domestic conditions of housing?
I think on the first point, the reality is that typically the point that architects leave a project is when that project really starts its functional operational life, and therefore I think obviously a practice like Atom Basal have a sort of an attitude of open-endedness, but the reality is for all architects, the life begins when their work ends, and so I think that we see I think it's about phases, right? There's this amazing phase of sort of first inception up till that opening. But then as whoever the organization is, or the group is, who's inhabiting the building or the structure or the street, as soon as they start inhabiting it, living it, that's when that place will start to evolve a culture. And over time, as new needs emerge, the structure will need to be edited and changed and grow in response to that. So I don't really ever see architecture as this fixed entity, although I think probably coming from the profession, we are so used to the finished project. I see it as something which really only starts at that beginning of the opening. And actually, I think that's been something which has been quite special for me with some of the projects which I've been connected with, both with this long-term community project in Liverpool, but also, building a new cultural arts space, which is that you become very conscious that you are there at a beginning, and then you see that culture evolving over time, and you see the need for new forms of growth or adaptation or change. One example with the art space is that they now have a really strong educational program, which they did not have at the outset. And so they're now looking to create a new space to serve the educational needs of the program and institution. And I kind of expect that that's every 5 years there'll be something like that, which is perhaps the conduit or the touch point which says this is what we're doing here, this is how we're trying to grow. And I think that kind of journey is a really fascinating part of architecture that is often much harder to document, because it's like how does an institution evolve over time? I'm sure there's a very interesting story to tell here in the space that we're in.
Yeah, I think that every time that the idea of a nuclear family is in crisis, we have been reconsidering domesticity over and over again. And there are like so many examples looking back, no? We can think about the 70s, for example. We can think about the dropouts in California and in many other places, and all the communes. We can think about lofts in New York. We can think about, communes in other places as well. And I think that now it's a very interesting moment and very difficult one as well. Point number one, because of the incredible precarity that we face. So people cannot afford to live as before, one. If you are a nuclear family with one kid maybe, people cannot divorce because they can afford to live separately. So then different association is being formed. And I think that, of course, we have to be in the forefront of this conversation in terms of design as well, no? And the other is because the models of the family and love also are changing once again, this is not new, very quickly as well. And I think that even in Spain in general, and here in Barcelona as well, and Catalonia, we have so many examples of people that have been researching about this. We can think about, 10 years ago, Andrés Jaque with the Rolling House for the Rolling Society. You have a film in the internet. Well, he researched about the amount of millions of people that are going around the world, moving and having to share apartments where the market doesn't allow really much flexibility in terms of sharing apartments in terms of adults, no, beyond this nuclear family. We can think about Eli as well, that is from Madrid, that think about minimum housing. But we can think about also living experiments, like, for example, Sociedad Cero here in Barcelona as well, no? So there are experiments going on, and I think that we have to be in this conversation. I also would mention maybe IKEA Disobedience from Andrés Jaque, where he states very clearly that the market doesn't reflect how we are. We are not nuclear families. We are not always healthy. We are not, we don't live as before. We don't have the same means. And we have to very quickly think about these issues as well. So all the responsibility we have, yes.
Okay, now, just that you are talking about also the Madrid offices, I would like to face I think that if this issue that if we also want to be like better connected with society and society with us and everything and to merge like all together, I think that there is something connected with the construction of the language, no? That maybe, I don't know, and this is a question, if we were really to build like a new language, no? In order to build these communities. I have listed like some of your, I would say, expressions, words that I really like to read a little bit in order to illustrate, to show how it works. Cristina, positive friction, creative conflict, celebratory technologies, distributed iconicity, pure performance in terms of program, ordinary sustainability in terms of construction, distributed iconicity, citizenship of the interiors, or architectural agonism. In the case of Paloma, other architects, an organic project, temporary arrangement, nomadic existence, agents of the future, tools for the civil engagement, tactics for makes changes, creating public narratives, city and communities. Are we more connected with society with this new language?
I mean, it's quite a complicated question. I think that the world of architecture is very disconnected from society for lots of reasons. I mean, Cristina, you touched on some of those at the opening, but I think actually the language that we use is often not very helpful. I think that the world of architecture has an interior language, as do all sectors and disciplines. So I don't think there's anything unique in kind of a bit of introspection and saying, why doesn't the rest of the world understand us? But I have to say, I think that people from beyond the discipline do often really struggle to understand the language and the perspective of architects. And I think that is a real challenge. And I don't think that is, I think that is a failure in some parts of us as a sector, because I think we like to think that we're good communicators, and that's evidently not the case. And so I do think that it's so important to be finding opportunities to open the conversation in a way that draws bridges, that is accessible, that doesn't speak in an internal disciplinary language, but actually tries to meet people in a way that they might be coming to architecture or urbanism perhaps for the first time. Perhaps they've spent a lot of time thinking about it. They probably have. They just have a very different language, which isn't, via an architecture school or via academia. And I think that is where there is so much opportunity via education, via exhibitions, via actually things like temporary architecture, which make people notice things for the first time in new ways and set up the opportunity for new conversations, new ways of understanding, new ways of thinking about things. But I think there's also evidently so much to be had in looking at the process of how our cities are made and built. And I think what we need to be doing is drawing more people into that conversation. And I think that the world of architecture, because I don't think actually there is anyone taking any meaningful ownership of it. I think there's a hole there, a void, and I think that it is such a powerful and positive position for architecture to take, to be the conveners of that new conversation and say, how can we establish a new, more open, more accessible, more productive conversation about our cities, about the environments we live. And look, there are so many important conversations for us to be talking to, like there is so much work to be done, whether that is around equality or sustainability like we're only at the beginning, but we're at a new beginning of these conversations, and there's a real opportunity to take a positive role in that.
Yes, I think that in language is such a fascinating and important topic, no? And I think that, of course, again, it depends on the public that you have. It's not the same talking about structure with an engineer or another architect that talking with the rest of the public, no? But also, it very much depends on where you are in the world. So here, basically, we are half engineers, let's say. We can sign structures, etc. If you go to the United States, for example, architecture is part of the humanities. So the language is actually different, no? I mean, you are taught somehow how to write a little bit more, no? But I think that even in the case where architecture is part of the humanities, architecture's language is extremely overly and hyper pragmatic. And if we don't change the language, our product will never change. And what happens with this very pragmatic language is that our city is mainly only pragmatic, and our architecture often is mainly only pragmatic as well, which is a disaster, I would say, no? So I think that I also have a project that is called the Architectures of Desire that researches about this issue of language, and I think that it's really interesting to look out of the discipline in a way we need it, no? To be able to innovate at least and experiment with other things. One very good example is, for example, the Canadian poet Anne Carson. If you take a look at her work, you will see many different projects, many different formats, micro lectures, talks, poems, some things that are very special, the designs of the books that are really like buildings themselves. So I think that is very, it would be great if we look a little bit outside and bring things to reinvent the language, yes. So that is not only pragmatic.
Do we have time for another one or not? I don't know, for just maybe another, the last one, or okay, and then maybe we open. Maybe most of you know that I think it was 2014, the Venice Biennale was directed by Rem Koolhaas, and it was addressed the issue architectural elements like windows, no, slabs, roofs, and so on. No? And this year, the jury of the Biennial gave the award to a material, no? Then just specifically a material, no a form or a canonical, I would say, like project. No, I think that this is, in my opinion, it's like a big change, and it seems that it's really like the starting point of a new era. I think that. And of course, this is connected with sustainability and as a new perspective that architecture should be architecture as a reorganized or reordered nature. No, I don't know, and this means that we have to redefine the idea of artificial. And in this sense, I don't know that this happens because in fact the future has catched the present, no? And now we're in a hurry in a way. And I don't know if it's possible, this redefinition of the artificial in terms of materiality. What do you think about
it? Well, I think that we've been talking about artificial materiality for a long time, no? I mean, all kinds of artificial materials. I didn't know that actually one of the prizes went to a material. So I don't know if I can really comment on that. No, because hopefully we are catch up by the future, yes.
It's
yes.
Just more information. No? There's a material, it's a salt that it's going to be like substituting like the cement. No? Then this, of course, is like a natural material. No, it's going to substitute the material that is really making our world like more contaminated. No, and I think that now, especially that, now that we build communities and with people, and people really start to know about, especially in their homes, no, this kind of biomaterials, and to know now is that Rem Koolhaas was talking about windows, and now it seems that we're talking about how this window is made of, no? And this, I think, it's a big change, no? Because people just maybe starting to ask themselves, okay, this is PVC or this is wood, and what is better, no? And this is changed because now we see like the wall is not, it's not a bag that we always get everything, no? It's it's finished.
Yeah, and I think that it's certainly a very exciting moment. I mean, I think we're all aware of the kind of the weight and the seriousness and the challenge that we face with climate change. And as a discipline, there's both an onus and a responsibility and an urgency in, re-looking at how we make things. And I think most people engaged in the profession, and probably most people, again, from any sector, would sort of hold up their hands and say, traditionally, in the past, in our education, in our experience, there wasn't a huge focus on sustainability, particularly, I'd say, sustainable materials. And actually, we are at a turning point. And actually, to go back to my previous point, I feel like I made a kind of quite maybe dogmatic point about language, but I think the exciting thing about language, and perhaps it should be languages, is that we don't need a singular voice. That the architecture, the urbanism, it never serves one purpose. There are times for all. There are moments for different types of language, and the language around sustainability is one of those which is emerging to the forefront, and certainly it's one which I think many of us are learning more about day by day, and it's really positive to see it come into the mainstream from something which I think was very much at periphery earlier on in my career, and see it as something which people understand both from an urgency to address.
In terms of this topic, I'm remembering once that I saw Naomi Klein in Sydney, and actually it was the day that Donald Trump took office, so it was very dramatic. And she said something extremely interesting. She said, if you care about the climate, don't go to the supermarket and buy a greener light bulb, because then you are falling in this circle of consumption, again, of an object that actually is even more expensive. Don't do that. Go to a room full of people talking about it. This is what maybe we should do, no? So I'm happy that maybe in the Venice Biennial now they're talking about it, as we are all.
Then maybe one last thing. I think that now architects were always, in a way, quite fascinated by the utopias, no? And in a way for the firm of architects and something like completely opposite to the authorless, no? In a way, how we can now it seems that utopia has died. How we can really, in a way, translate this to society in the sense that it seems that, for example, in one moment we say that Assemble was working with no plan in a way, no, because that is not. We have to work with the present. But I think that this is. Change a lot the way of working, no? Because now we have to work with the present. What do you think about it?
I think that utopias are coming back really strongly. I mean, teaching all over the world in a way, London, the United States, in South America. We are so hopeless somehow looking at the future. We don't know exactly what to do, no? That there's all this movement of people trying to look in a very avant-garde way, no? Like without having all the means to build things still, but really looking with some sort of militant optimism to the future, exaggerating things a little bit maybe, no? So yeah, I think that it's something that is in the air, and I think that that's very good actually, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, obviously kind of what the idea of what a utopia is has evolved, but I think that I agree that this sort of moment of more of global activism around issues from climate change to sort of race and equity, we are seeing people critically look at the world as it is and say, how can we radically reform it to make it more just, more equal, more resilient. And I think that the shifts that lots of those movements are asking or demanding do represent a new type of utopia, and and open up the possibility of a really radically reformed world that is, I think, probably quite different to the one that we know.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Just before starting, like to open the conversation to the audience, just to fix like some words for my library after that I think that they're very interesting that you have said, and I think they're very interesting, like social sustainability, which I think it's very important, stopping to growth, reprogram, research. I think that now people start to understand what means research in architecture. It's not something only about history, and I think that this is very important. Better use, which also I completely agree, and trust. And I think that this is very important, like this idea of now we have to trust in architecture more than ever, because, and this is, I think, today was a very good opportunity to talk about this. Then, any questions or comments from complaints? It was too dense, not really.
Good evening. I just wanted to pick another word from the conversation. I don't know even if it was there, but somehow hidden, yes, which is the time and the dilemma that the time brings to this urgency. On one hand, we have the urgency, the house is on fire, the city is on fire, the hurry to solve all the problems. But on the other hand, there is this experience of this working little by little with the community, building the confidence, and how do you see these two times, like the time of urgency and then the necessary time to build relationships and build these communities and build the trust to be able to actually provocate change?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's probably a similar answer to my one in language, which is that there are different times and that we have to, we are always working to different timescales, and there are contexts where it feels like there is true scope to move quickly. Like, I feel like the move towards building more with timber or CLT, as an example, is one that we could take with real speed and urgency. But I think that the reality of working with people is that it can be slow, and that cultural change does not happen overnight. And I've rarely seen, I think, an effective cultural project which did, because people take time to adapt. So I just, I think it is really interesting to think about time, and I think the only authentic answer is to say that there are different times, and kind of the skill or the strategy is to work out where are the most effective places where you could move fast. And I think, obviously, from the kind of position of climate change, we should be looking at those and strategizing accordingly. And where do we recognize, on the other hand, the spaces where we might need to move more slowly for effective change to happen?
Yes, I think that the answer is that the same. No, they have to live together. We have the time of the urgency. How can we stop this earthquake of destruction? No climatic change, but climatic catastrophe and the destruction of cities. But also, I would say that as opposed to that, we have the politics of care, which is something that has appeared during the pandemic, and let's hope that it continues as well, which is a tricky term, again, as well-being. But still, I think that the best definition of the politics of care or of care itself is the one that Donna Haraway gives, which is curiosity. It links it to curiosity, no? So the curiosity of the other takes a little bit of time. It can't be like a war policy, no strategy of defend yourself. But I think that is a very good point, yes.
Okay, anybody else? Enric, venga.
Complaints now or never. Speechless.
Speechless. Silence.
Hola, os hago la pregunta en castellano y la traducís al inglés. La pregunta no es para vosotros porque no ha sido nada aburrido, ha sido muy interesante todo lo que estamos hablando. La pregunta es, yo soy arquitecto, soy habitante del planeta Tierra, pero me gustaría saber de todos los presentes, que todos somos habitantes del planeta Tierra, ¿cuántos de los aquí, en este lado, somos arquitectos?
Bueno, es un 50-50, ¿no? Yo lo tenía apuntado, pero no voy a hacer la pregunta. Yo creo que también el otro día hablaba con un arquitecto muy radical, y me hacía un comentario muy interesante que era, digamos, un poco extremo, ¿no? Decía, como los arquitectos hasta ahora hemos estado mirando qué es lo que hacían los otros arquitectos, ¿no? Y no estábamos como mirando al medio. Yo creo que al final, digamos, bueno, esto, yo creo que un poco este listado, lo que he leído al principio, digamos, a nivel como oficial, ¿no? de como estos premios, digamos que al final estos premios siempre hay que leerlos con esta clave de cambio, en realidad, y yo creo que de alguna manera haber pasado de una época, digamos, ¿no? de una arquitectura icónica un poco a una arquitectura como iconoclasta, yo creo que este ha sido un gran cambio. Creo que el arquitecto ha estado mirando, digamos, debe mirar mucho más al medio, pero también yo creo que de alguna manera sí que está... yo creo que la gente realmente está mucho más sensibilizada sobre, digamos, el papel del arquitecto, y si de alguna manera estaba implícito en alguna de las preguntas, hay proyectos que están absolutamente abiertos, que no están cerrados, en los cuales de alguna manera se ofrece un espacio, en el caso de la catón basal, extraordinario, digamos extra y ordinario, pero ordinario en tanto que cotidiano, ¿no? Y esto es como una posición, y por el otro lado hay también una voluntad de, en el interior, el arquitecto casi un poco arts and craft, en alguna maqueta de algún proyecto he visto que están unas gafas encima de una mesa, una botella, una planta, ¿no? Casi lo de la domesticidad previa es casi como el arquitecto ofrece, yo creo que con muy buena voluntad, casi como la vivencia de ese espacio, ¿no? Casi como si estrenase la casa, en cierto modo. Pero yo creo que hay como estas, bueno, dualidades, y creo que en ese sentido el arquitecto sí que está como ahora mismo intentando como, digamos, adoptar otra posición, aunque creo que esta mirada al medio y entender la arquitectura, como se puede entender la arquitectura vernácula de la arquitectura sin arquitectos, digamos, de una materialidad reordenada, yo creo que ahora cada vez más, casi incluso tendremos que tender a eso por necesidad.
I think that the sector is very traditional, and I think there's true value in traditional architecture, but I also think that some of the bigger changes are going to come from companies or groups or studios that do not fit anything resembling a traditional definition of an architecture studio. And I think it would probably be really helpful if we found a way of kind of opening the conversation or opening the language to kind of include those people who might be doing projects around the city, affecting it in ways that maybe have never been before, but are not part of the dialogue. So one example that I will have, and you know, for better or worse, is an organization like Uber. Like, how do we talk about Uber within architecture? It's like one example of one company that, you know, or an Airbnb, two companies which have radically transformed how we use, inhabit, reprogram cities, that have meant that we're not building more, but we're using it more intensely, more, in different ways. And like, what's the next one going to be? What's the one which is going to be around sustainable building products, as an example? Like, I think that there are so many interesting spaces for people with architectural skills to be going into, and I think that the companies and the organizations will not look like traditional studios, but I'm really excited to say to, you know, younger architects or people who are kind of coming up from their education, don't look at other architects or other architecture firms for where you want to be going for solving the problems that you want to address. Look at the issues which matter to you most. So let's take sustainability, and what are the opportunities or the tools or the platforms or the ways of organizing that can help you solve those issues the best. And I think that they will have exciting new forms with which could result in kind of much greater, much more positive impact than lots of the kind of traditional celebrated firms of the past.
In terms of practice, I think that you can find very different formats of practice and interest within these offices. No, you can think about offices, let's say, that talks mainly about politics, like forensic architecture, like cooking sections, for example, like many others, right? So that's one thing. I say, here it's more strict in this land. We are architects, we build. If you cross the Atlantic, for example, or if you go to England, for example, or other countries, it's broader, really. You can do investigations, you can play and work with other people as well, no? The other thing is, I think there is some urgency to learn how to say no. Because for a very long time, maybe for 20 years, the motto of architecture was yes, and the yes was the yen, the euro, and the dollar, no? And I mean, I think that we have an ethical responsibility as well to say no to certain things. And the other thing is that as architects, we are very good at identifying certain urban phenomena, like, for example, Airbnb, like many others, no? Things that have to do with sustainability as well right now. But we are very bad sometimes at creating resistance to that phenomena. So, for example, Airbnb, and this city is like a laboratory of resistance in a way, no, to Airbnb, completely destroys the social fabric of the city, and it's been like proof over and over again. So, how can we rethink buildings or policies so that we can protect locals as well, instead of how can we design so that we can improve and also make it faster, intensify this phenomenon, no? So I think that even within more traditional architecture, we have to sharpen our critical skills. That would be hopefully the future as well.
Enrique, thank you.
I think I can try to put a question. I don't know if I'll be able to, but however, I was just wondering if there's been a trend that has been claiming for autonomy. So as if architecture itself would be able to solve some of our problems. Would you think if in your practice, do you think construction and material architecture, so to see how things are made and built, can be helping somehow these building communities that we talked about today? So is the discipline, has it some capacity to go further in terms of just construction, but trying to see these in the frame of these greater building communities? I don't know if I was, I mean, do you think that construction itself, have you become more, do you like it more as soon as your practice goes on through the years?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly it was one of the values which I really gained from studying architecture, which was that, that we live in a world that can feel so unmalleable, and that we have no control over our physical environments, and that the act of learning architecture was the act of learning that it's infinitely malleable, that you have a chance to make and remake a world that is entirely man-made. And so I think that that was also something which we always took into the spirit of particularly early Assemble projects, which was, for us, that first chance to build ourselves, and in that way learn by doing and see a very direct impact between what we were designing, how we made it, and then the kind of the final outcome. But it was also about opening that language, that conversation with others, because we thought it was really empowering. And so our early projects, the building sites were, we were volunteers ourselves. We opened the sites to others. It was a lot of people just getting involved, whether it was for a couple of hours or for a longer period of time, to help build these kind of collective theatrical projects. And part of that was practical. It was great to have sort of many hands involved. But part of that was theoretical, like it was about saying, opening up this kind of provocation to say, so now you know that you can build in this world, what does that apply to how does that apply to your own scenario? Now, I don't think it's critical that people themselves build everything all the time. It's certainly not the attitude that we continue to have in Assemble, but what I do hold on to is the fact that it is incredibly enabling to have at your disposal, like you might with another subject, whether that's biology or maths or economics, some of the very basic tools in the first instance to help you understand how you that you have agency and power to shape the world around you.
In terms of autonomy, I'm remembering Peter Asseman in New York telling us, an audience of professors and students, that we were nothing, saying, you cannot do anything, you have no relevance at all, you can go home and stay there forever, right? Now, you have to take in consideration also in the States, the architecture business is taken by big corporations mainly. So really they cannot do much. And also they have this culture of do it yourself. But then, of course, if you look at other places in the world, especially but not only after the 2008-2009 crisis, you see that this is completely unrealistic. Of course, you can do a lot. I mean, and the citizens, the general citizenry is not stupid whatsoever. They can see the quality in the public space, they can see the quality in housing, although we don't offer that much because the market doesn't allow that many times, no? So I think that construction and change, political change that had to do with health, change that had to do with sustainability is totally related. I mean, here as well, locally, we can see, for example, the experiments that La Colle has been making in terms of cooperatives, for instance, no? So I don't think that you can separate. Another thing is the autonomy-related formal experiments that in these centers that are very specialized, like universities, we make in order to advance certain topics and talk about them, But in terms of society, we are very much embedded in it, and we have like a huge relevance, I would say. I don't think that we can deny that, yeah.
Good. Maybe we have to finish with this verse now. Anybody else? I have the focus and I can see. Sorry. Any questions? Okay, then time is up. Just to finish, we agree that there is hope. Then we trust in society, not only in architecture, we trust in society. Then thank you very much for being here and for your involvement and answering all the emails and to the questions and so on. Like, it has been a pleasure, and I have learned a lot. Thank you very much. Just to introduce like the next debate tomorrow és el segon debat que s'ha organitzat a la tarda, que es titula Equilibrar el territori, i anirà a càrrec de Maria Buigas i José María Ezquiaga, i serà un debat moderat per Ricardo de Besa. O sigui que us esperem a tots demà aquí en aquest mateix espai. Moltes gràcies.
Thank you.
Thank you.